Hello, my Ravens. Today we're going to be doing a reading from my third book, The Bone Spirit. Sorry I haven't been around in a while. It's been a rough week. Let's get right started with Chapter 1. Jamie Conrad sat next to his bed, hungover. Outside, the rain bounced off his tin roof. He reeked of alcohol and would need a thorough shower before leaving the house. His heartbeat pounded inside of his head, and each drop of rain sounded like an amplified drum beat. He had to get the horrible morning taste out of his mouth, or he'd soon vomit. James hadn't always been such a heavy drinker, but since the writer's block began, it had become a regular thing. A fairly successful author, his first two books had hit the top 5 on the New York Times bestseller list. After his third novel, his ideas had just dried up like somebody turning off a faucet. What began as a minor annoyance eventually evolved into full-blown stress. That was when he began to see the skeleton man. Now here he sat in his own filth, feeling like he was losing his mind. James walked into the bathroom, and after relieving himself, took a long look in the mirror. Huge bags rimmed bloodshot eyes. His brown hair was a mess, and it had been days since his last shave. He looked more like a 51-year-old than a 31-year-old. Casey. She'd kill him if she saw him now. Even though they'd been divorced for a year and a half, they still cared deeply for each other. He wished she were here right now. Whenever he was down, she always knew what to do to make him smile again. She was one of those girls who got a high out of life. He supposed that it was his constantly depressed and melancholy attitude that had ultimately driven her away. James scoffed. He had enough sitting around feeling sorry for himself for one morning. Feeling like a prisoner in his own home, he needed to get away. After a hot shower, James brushed his teeth and did what he could with his hair. He grabbed his keys and headed for his black Camaro. Casey had loved this old car. James had hoped the drive would clear his mind and calm his nerves, but nothing changed. He could not shake from his mind the horrific images he'd been seeing. Not to mention, he had to turn the darn radio off completely. Whether it was country, pop, or 80s rock, they were all sappy songs about wanting a woman back. James swore the radio knew what he was thinking sometimes. He drove to good old Starbucks. This spot more than any got his creative juices flowing, or at least it had in the past. He'd not been here in a while, but he ordered his old usual, an iced mocha and a croissant. He then went to his favorite table in the back by the window. He always sat with his back against the wall like a gunslinger afraid of being shot in the back of the head. It wasn't that he was going to be viewing pornography, but he had always hated the idea of someone looking over his shoulder. James sipped his latte and took a bite of his croissant, waiting patiently for a great idea to come. He stared at the blank page on his laptop in front of him. Nothing came. 10 minutes passed. He was down to a third of the latte and had finished his croissant. Still no ideas had come. 5 more minutes passed and the page remained blank. He couldn't think of so much as a catchy title. James was halfway tempted to throw his computer across the room, but he didn't want to garner any more disturbing looks than he already had. Besides, $900 wasn't pocket change. The rain had ran down the store's windows in rivulets, picking up every passing minute. In times past, this alone would have filled him with ideas dealing in the horror genre. He stared at his reflection. The flowing water had made it look as if he were crying rivers. There was a flash of lightning, and his reflection turned into that of the skeleton man. Mortified, he turned and buried his face in his hands. What is happening to me? James Conrad! He was startled by a voice saying his name. He looked up as if he had been lost in thought. The person speaking to him was a young man no older than 25, wearing glasses. As it turned out, he was an eager young admirer. It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Conrad. I'm a huge fan. James had heard this at least 100 times before, but he never grew tired of it. He had enjoyed a fair amount of success, more than a lot of people, but he was far from an icon in the book world. James extended his hand and said, "Nice to meet you, Mr. Ted Stanford," he said, shaking James's hand. "Always nice to meet a fan. Oh, yes, I bought a copy of A Dance in the Snow. I couldn't put it down. It usually takes me at least 2 weeks to finish a book, but I finished it in just 3 days." "Well, I appreciate that. I see you have your laptop. Are you working on that long-awaited 4th novel?" "Attempting to," he said, not lying. "Well, I can't wait for it. I'll leave it to your work now. Pleasure to meet you." James smiled as the young man walked away. Now officially depressed, he sighed and looked out into the rain. Sure, he wasn't a one-hit wonder, but he hadn't envisioned being a three-hit wonder after a 4-year career. He had a nice $550,000 in the bank, a nice nest egg, but nowhere near Koontz or King money. There'd been rumors that his third and least successful book, A Town in Darkness, was going to be made into a TV movie, but he'd not heard anything thus far. Money and fame were now the least of his worries, though. Now he feared for his sanity. If he kept seeing images of hellish creatures, he was afraid he might one day be straitjacketed in a rubber room mumbling to himself. James dared to look out once more. Nothing but usual daily traffic drifted by. Headlights shined in the rain as clear as they did at midnight. Lightning flashed across the sky, and once again the skeleton man was there in traffic, only visible to him. No cars stopped or horns blared as vehicles merely drove through him. The urge to vomit rose again. James blinked twice, but vision still remained. After blinking a third time, the skeleton man was gone. James put his computer back in his carrying case, his more and more frequent hallucinations pushing him toward a panic attack. He would kill as much time in the day as he could if it meant going back home, to prison where he would face all these images, alone. James was home at 9. He carried 2 small grocery bags full of crap he didn't need, and had taken him 2 hours of aimlessly wandering the aisles to buy. He'd seen 2 friends that he chatted up for as long as possible. Now with a sigh, he set the bags on the table and pulled out the rented video he didn't really want to watch. He had savored his fine Italian dinner for over an hour. His whole day had consisted of wasting time and accomplishing nothing. What's the point? It had been the same thing for the last 2 months. He woke up every morning and unsuccessfully attempted to write something new. He would then become frustrated and give up. After wasting time the entire day and finally coming back home, he would drink himself sick. It was time for the last part, and James poured himself a glass of scotch. In his study, he stared blankly at 3 bookcases full of hundreds of books by his favorite authors, Dickens, Poe, and Hemingway, just to name a few. At the top of the first shelf was his small contribution to literacy. 3 novels sitting in the order in which they'd been written: A Dance in the Snow, The Mortician, and A Town in Darkness. He remembered the day that he found out that Snow had made it into the top 10 of the New York Times bestseller list, where it eventually peaked at 4. He'd been filled with premature pride and assumed that every book he wrote would be a hit, and that soon he and Casey would be living the high life with fancy cars and a huge mansion. They would spend every day drinking only the most expensive imported beer, dining on caviar, and living like royalty. It didn't take long for that dream to crumble. His work had gradually gone downhill with every release. The second novel received mostly positive reviews, but every critic said it lived in the shadow of his first. After the mediocre reviews of his third book, people had hoped he would soon bounce back with his fourth. Unfortunately, the fourth one never came. His contract with his agent had been a 3-book deal. Since not even as much of an idea for another book came to him, his contract was not extended. Now, the only remnants of his success were his car, the house, and his bank account. His name had not been in the magazine for over 4 months. He was rarely ever stopped by a fan for an autograph, as used to be the case. Why couldn't he have been one of those writers that had written 5 to 10 books before even making it onto the scene? When he had been a struggling writer with a dream, ideas came to him in floods. Then when he was being paid for them, they seemed to stop cold. He sighed and ran his face across the He sighed and ran his hand across the spines of his past. Finishing off the last of his scotch, he rushed to pour another as if the alcohol would preserve him. After topping off his glass, he sat down on the sofa and read the Daily News. At least the lush leather sofa felt like heaven. Even though he wasn't going to be in Forbes magazine anytime soon, he made sure his house was filled with nice things. Besides the sofa, there was a leather recliner and a U-shaped couch on the other side of the room. The sofa sat in front of his 42-inch flat screen. The coffee table in front of the sofa was marble riddled with the circles of drinks he had sat there without a coaster. James's current drink left a ring as he lifted it once more and continued to read the paper. On the front page, a huge article reported a deadly fire that had killed a family of 4 the previous day. Neighbors had taken in the 2 family dogs that had been devastated by the loss of their owners. He flipped through the pages, browsing every story. Nothing caught his eye until he came to the bottom of page 5. There was a story about a death of a well-known author. Personally, James had only read one of the man's books, but he had a huge following. In big black letters was the headline, "Popular Writer Commits Suicide, Age 42." Such a waste. The story told of how the man had put out 10 books, 8 of which were bestsellers, but he hadn't put out anything new in over a year. A female friend of his had found him hanging in his study. She said that he had been suffering from writer's block for a while, but she never would have thought he would kill himself over it. He'd left a note that said, "I have run out of books. There is no more to give. So now I will close the book that is my life." James literally threw the paper to the side. Those words chilled him to the bone, and no amount of alcohol could warm him up again. This man had loved writing so much that he couldn't do it anymore. When he couldn't do it anymore, he would rather die than to go on. This man had been in the same situation James was in, and that frightened him the most. Plus, this was the 3rd story of a writer committing suicide in the last 2 months. It wasn't proven that writer's block had led to the demise of the previous 2, but one had to wonder. By far, James felt that the writing world had the highest suicide rate of any. I should kill myself, too. James gagged at as the thought came to his mind. Things were not that bad. It was just writer's block. He had a nice house, a nice car, and plenty of money in the bank. He then began to hear a voice that was not his own. The voice filled his head with thoughts that he couldn't shoo away. "You're not happy. What good is money without happiness? Casey's gone. She doesn't love you anymore. You will never get her back, and no woman will ever love you like she did. You won't find love again. Any woman you have will end in only cheap, meaningless sex that will leave you empty inside. All you do every day is wake up and repeat the same pattern over and over again. Then you get drunk and sleep in your own filth. Is that how you want to live the rest of your life? End it now." He was being charmed like Eve by the serpent in Eden. He stood and placed his glass on the shiny marble. He then walked over to the kitchen and pulled a butcher's knife from the block. He made his way to the bathroom and looked into the mirror. Hopelessness and despair covered his face. "Just end it all," the voice continued. James used his shaky right hand to put the blade to his opposite wrist. He pressed the blade into his flesh and winced as it began to sting. When he looked at his hand that held the blade, he saw the hand of the skeleton man pressing on top of his own, gently guiding him to do what needed to be done. End it all. Before the blade penetrated any further, he broke out of the trance and looked at the knife horrified. He dropped to the floor and went to his knees. Lifting the toilet seat, he vomited into the bowl. Wheezing, James sat down beside the toilet and wept like a baby into his hands. He was terrified for his sanity now. He couldn't believe what he had almost done. He was suffering from a horrible depression, but he still wanted to live. The thoughts that had filled his head frightened him even more. They felt like they weren't even his own. What the hell was the skeleton man? When he thought that he couldn't get any lower, a thought came to his mind that brightened his heart like a child on Christmas morning. Casey. He needed Casey. Yes, they were divorced, but they still cared about each other, and they were there when they needed each other. Once when her washing machine was on the blink, he fixed it for her so she wouldn't have to call a repairman. Shortly after the divorce was final, James had sprained his ankle and was on crutches. Casey had done his shopping for him so he could stay off his feet. He rushed over into the living room, picked up the phone, and dialed her number. It was 15 after 10, and she was likely in bed. She answered on the 4th ring. "Hello? Casey, it's James. I need you." "James?" she said with sleep still in her voice. "I know we had sex one time after we separated, but I told you I wasn't making a habit of it. You have my permission to get a hooker," she joked. "If you get busted for soliciting, I'll bail you out." As she had failed to recognize the genuine desperation in his voice, James broke into tears. "Casey, I really need you. I'm afraid to be alone. I'm afraid of what I might do." There was a short pause. Holy shit, you're serious, aren't you? Please, Casey, can you come here? Yes. Yes, I'll be there in a few minutes. Hold on, I'm coming. She hung up the phone without saying goodbye, likely rushing out of fear. She had never in all their time together heard him talk like this. He knew that because he had never heard himself talk like this. I think that's a good point to leave off. Did that pique your curiosity? If so, all you have to do is go to Amazon, Nook, or Kindle and get The Bone Spirit. $2.99 on Nook and Kindle, and like $11 and something maybe on Amazon. But anyway, and if you like this video, like and subscribe, like the video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you. This has been another reading from me, and as I always say, happy reading.